the story of a well-known theologian who had spent his lifetime studying scripture and theology, and they asked him one day, what do you think is the greatest statement of theology that you know? And he said, well, I think if Jesus loves me, this I know for the Bible. Back in the 90s, there was a popular Christian song that said, our God is an awesome God. And that statement is, of course, much more than just the words of the song. It's the reality of daily life. And particularly as we look at the life of Elijah, I think we see it very vividly there. Elijah, this prophet of God, has been hiding in the gorge of the Kerith Brook for about a year of time. God had put him there, of course, remember, to hide him from King Ahab, the king of Israel. Because Ahab had been given this message by Elijah that said, there's going to be no rain until I give the word. And the reason for that, because the people of Israel had turned away from the true and living God, and they had begun to worship this false god Baal, who was supposedly the god of fertility and of rain. And so this was an affront to Baal, that they would say there would be no rain. Jezebel, who was King Ahab's wife, a Phoenician princess, had brought the worship of Baal into Israel with some force. Baal had always been a temptation to Israel as an agricultural economy, but now, with being promoted from the highest place in the land, it had become far more prevalent. So Elijah blew this message, and at first I'm sure Ahab didn't take it very seriously, but after no rain came, and this was the beginning of the rainy season, he began a nationwide search, nationwide manhunt for Elijah. In fact, it even became an international manhunt as he asked kings around to search for him as well. But all during this frantic search by Ahab, Elijah is tucked safely away there in the Kerith Gorge, being taken care of, drinking from the brook, and being fed supernaturally by the ravens. But now the brook's drying up. And as I mentioned last week, first, this was an encouragement to Elijah, because it meant, in fact, no rain was falling, and that the prayers that he prayed had been answered. But as it began to diminish more and more, he began to realize his source of water was drying up. And finally, as we looked at last week, it gets to the place where it says the brook dried up. And I mentioned last week that word, that Hebrew word that's used there, literally means no water. It was all gone. Now, God had put Elijah there in the gorge by the brook to protect him for this year. But now that the brook is dried up, God's not up in heaven wringing his hands, scratching his forehead, saying, well, what am I going to do next? No, God knows the entire plan of what he's going to do with Elijah. But he only reveals it to Elijah one step at a time. And so it wasn't until the brook dried up that Elijah knew the next step he was supposed to take. That's hard for us, isn't it? To trust God one step at a time. We want to know what God's plan is, and there's still plenty of water in the brook. So I don't ever want to have to think that I'm going to go without, have any kind of fear of that. So God, just tell me what you're doing. But God wants us to trust him, and one of the ways he teaches us to do that is just reveal to us one step at a time what he wants us to do, how he's going to care for us. Well, when the moment came and God reveals the next step to Elijah, it comes as quite a surprise. Now, God always takes care of his people. He never forsakes his people, but sometimes he surprises us by the way he does it. And what God now does in his care for Elijah is to so orchestrate the care of his prophet that at the same time he's going to care for somebody else. Well, let's read about that. It's in 1 Kings chapter 17. I'd like to read verses 8 to 16 1 Kings 17, verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to him, Arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks, and he called her and said, Bring me a little water in a vessel, that I may drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called her and said, Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. And she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar, and a little oil in a jug. And now I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. And Elijah said to her, Do not fear, go and do as you said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. And she went and did as Elijah said, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. So God sends Elijah to this widow in Zarephath. Now, Zarephath is really a small town. It's a port city on the coast of the Mediterranean, and it's about halfway between the two major Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon. And what this means is that this city to which God is sending Elijah is in Jezebel's homeland. So as he goes there, he is walking right smack into the middle of all those people who worship Baal. He's walking right into enemy territory. It'd be a little bit like somebody, like God coming to a Christian widow here, or a Christian preacher here, and saying, I want you to go hide with a widow in Iraq or China. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, does it? But you know, faith is not about logic. Now, I'm not saying that our faith is illogical or rational. It is certainly not. But faith is not about logic. It's about obeying God. And God doesn't always operate on human principles of logic. And here is Elijah being told to do something that just appears very bizarre, but so often God does exactly the opposite of what we expect. And I think he does that, so when it's all over, we have to say, nobody could have done that except God. You know, Jesus refers to this event when he's in Nazareth and he's sort of being snubbed or he's being scorned by the people of Nazareth because he's just one of them. And in Luke chapter 4, he says to them, Truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. You know, every time I read that verse, I wonder to myself, how many people I overlooked because I've been too close to them? How many people I not think really were that important because I knew them too well? But in truth, I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and a great famine came over all the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath, the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. Jesus is saying there were a lot of widows in Israel during this time. But God didn't send Elijah to any of them. He sent him to this foreign widow. Well, partly because it was a lot safer for Elijah to be out of Israel, where Ahab had more power, than it was to be in Israel. But I think also because God was not just punishing Ahab and Jezebel and the higher-ups of the land, also the people who would be poor and on the lower level socially of the land, he was also punishing them. Well, why did God choose this widow? I think that's an interesting thought. Why did he choose this widow? And as I think about that, my response would be, I think it's because this woman was living in a foreign country, but I think she was a believer in God. And I think that because, for several reasons. First of all, because in verse 12, she calls God by name. If you'll notice there in verse 12, she refers to him as the Lord, but that word Lord is in all capital letters. And And that means that this is God's personal name. This is the name Yahweh. And it would be very unusual for a foreign person, particularly a woman, to know God's personal name that even the Jewish people themselves, Israelis, they wouldn't even pronounce it. It was so holy to them that they wouldn't even say the word. They would always substitute the Hebrew word Adonai, which means Lord, for his name. And so for her to actually know this is very unusual, and I think that the reason she does is because in a country that is focused on the worship of Baal, she is a worshiping God. And not only that, notice she describes him as living. He is the Lord, your God who lives. She lives in a country where Baal's supposed to be the living God, not Yahweh. And secondly, I think that we might see her faith because she's very controlled in her answers to Elijah's requests. She could have lashed out at him. I mean, here was a man asking food from a poor widow. Couldn't he read the poverty and the pain in her face? Couldn't he see how desperate she was? Now, she immediately identifies him as an Israelite. How does she know that? You know, she says, "Your God," so she knows he's an Israelite. That's kind of shrouded a bit in mystery. I mean, Elijah could have identified himself. We don't have that in text. It's possible. I think it's more likely she recognized him because of the way he was dressed. And probably because Israelites were dressed very different than Phoenicians, she immediately recognized him as not only a foreigner, but somebody from Israel. It's not one of her countrymen. And she could have, when he asked this, she could have begged pity. She could have said, "Look, take pity on me. You know, I'm struggling here." She doesn't do any of that. Her responses appear very controlled. She simply states the facts so that he will understand her situation. And it seems to me that this might indicate that God has done something of a spiritual work in her life to give her such calm in the midst of such difficulty. And she's gone through difficulty. It's obvious she's lost her husband. She's been left with a young son. Now her supplies of food are diminishing so that there's almost none left. And yet we don't see her expressing bitterness or blame at all. Thirdly, I think she might be a believer because we don't see it in this text, but in a couple of weeks we'll get down further and we'll see about the death of her son. And in the death of her son, we realize she's conscious of her sin. Now that's kind of an unusual thing. In the ancient world, you know, people did have a sense of sin, unlike our culture that really doesn't have any sense of sin. The only sense of sin we have is to say somebody's wrong. That's a terrible sin, to say they're wrong about anything they think or feel. But in the ancient world, they did have a consciousness of sin, but it was not a moral consciousness, it was a ritual consciousness. So in other words, if a person's experienced something bad in their life, they wouldn't say, "Oh my, this is because I lied, you know, because I stole something I shouldn't have taken, because I've committed some other kind of moral transgression." No, they would say, "Well, the reason this is happening is because I didn't offer the right offering to the right God in his temple." So instead of seeing sin as a moral failure, they saw it as a ritual misstep. But this woman, unlike that, she actually understands moral sin. She realizes she is morally culpable before God. And then finally, I think her response after the resurrection of her son, we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, I think again, it causes to see she understood something about who God is. So it seems to me it's likely that this woman is a believer in the true God, even though she lives in Jezebel's homeland. Now, how did that happen? How in the world could that happen? Well, again, that's somewhat, I think, shrouded in mystery, and I've read all kinds of commentaries and books about this. And the one that makes the most sense to me is the idea that her husband, when he was alive, was somehow involved in trade or whatever that involved Judah, and Jehoshaphat is the king of Judah, and he is a godly king, and there's still godliness going on there. And that because of that trait, he began to understand who the true God was, and he turned to him and led his family in that direction as well. So, this woman, I think, is a woman who believes in the true God. She has changed her allegiance, essentially, from Baal to Yahweh. And we might ask ourselves, how has life been for her since that happened? Well, her husband's died. I don't think it's probably been too long prior to this because her child is still young. She has experienced the drought and the famine, and now she's down to her last meal, and there are no jobs for women in this culture except basically prostitution. It hasn't been easy for her, and I can imagine she has neighbors who are aware of what's happened, who might have said, look, your life has been really tough ever since you turned away from Baal. You need to come back to Baal. You need to worship him again, and then life will be better for you. And maybe she was tempted to do that. But at this point, God sends her Elijah. Maybe you can identify this widow a little bit. Now, I don't think any of us have circumstances quite as dire as she does, where we're ready to go and cook our last meal and curl up in bed and die. But we have our struggles too, financial struggles. Sickness that racks our body, no matter how we try to take care of it, the death of people we love. And some of these things can test whether or not we will continue to follow God. We might ask ourselves, I think the widow could have asked herself this, and let's face it, we probably, all of us at some point in our spiritual walk, if we've been Christians very long, have to ask ourselves, does God really love me? Does he really care about me when I'm going through hard times? And the answer is a resounding yes, he does. And this woman, what she needed, yes, was food. That's pretty obvious. But you know what else she needed? She needed to understand more about who this God was that she had turned to. And she got both those things in Elijah. So here's this widow. God sent Elijah to her. So Elijah comes and he makes these requests. Now, why did Elijah ask for the things he asked for? Well, certainly he asked for them because he'd just taken a long trip and he was thirsty and he was hungry. Makes sense. But as you look at these requests, each one of them kind of shows a progression in difficulty. So I believe God likely told him exactly how to ask for these things. I mean, after all, how else could he know about the miraculous provision of flour and oil? And it was a way for him to identify the widow he was supposed to stay with. So his first request is water. Now, that would be pretty easy for her to do, even though it has not rained. As I mentioned earlier, Zarephath is a port city right on the Mediterranean Sea. And we all know what it's like when you live near water. The water table is pretty high, and access to water is somewhat easier. My mother grew up in South Dakota. In South Dakota, they have what they call artesian wells. And these are wells they sink down 1,000 feet or more in order to get water. Because if you look at where South Dakota is, not around much water. Where me, I live over there in Norton Shores, not far from Lake Michigan. You go down 25 feet and get a flood. Well, this woman lives near that kind of water situation, so she doesn't appear to have any difficulty in going and getting him water. But then as she's going, she's on her way. She's going to do what she's asked to do. Elijah makes his second request, which is much more difficult, and that is to give him food. That's been her worry for months. Maybe she and her son are already showing some signs of malnutrition because she's trying to stretch out this little amount of food that she had and make it last as long as she possibly could. And so when Elijah asks her, she just kind of puts the situation to him, well, this is it. I'll have this little bit left. I'm going to make the last meal for me and my son before we die. I kind of wonder if she thought telling him the situation would make him say, oh, I'm sorry I asked. But what a surprise when he doesn't back off. In fact, responds in a way she doesn't expect. He tells her, look, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Go and prepare the food just like you planned, but before you eat it, bring me some to eat. And if you do, God will provide. Let me ask you this morning, what would you have done if that had been you? You've got this little bit of food. You've got a little son. You already know that it's not good. Are you going to take the food out of your child's mouth and give it to this guy you've never met before? That's a great test of her faith. That's a great test of her faith. Reminds me so much of Jesus and the rich young ruler. Remember the story of the rich young ruler? Jesus says to him, sell all you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. And we all remember the story. He went away sad because he had a great wealth. He wouldn't do it. And this is basically Elijah asking this woman to do exactly the same thing. Give everything you have and trust me. It doesn't seem fair when others have so much and she has so little. And here must have been a moment of tension. The moment when faith was being stretched to the breaking point. What will she do? Elijah's future rests on it, though we know God will take care of Elijah. But her future and the future of her son also rests on it. Well, she responds. She gets the water and she makes the bread for Elijah. She kind of put all her eggs in one basket. I'm going to trust God. Surely, as she looked at Elijah and recognized him as a Jew and recognized the words he was saying about God, that this was no accident that God had put this man here at this time. And so she gives Elijah the food to eat, and I just picture her. She gives Elijah the food to eat, and then together they go back to her house, and she goes and lifts down the jug that had the oil and the pot that had the flour, and she emptied them out. Just a little while before, she's emptied them out so Elijah could have his food. He promised her that there would be flour and oil if she did this, and now she lifts it down. And she lifts the lid and she looks in. Will there be anything there? There, in the bottom of the jar, is the flour. In the bottom of the jug, there's some oil. Can you imagine what she felt at that moment? God had supplied the very thing she so desperately needed. I don't think God supplied her with giant amounts of grain. I don't think she walked into her, room and there was a whole room full of grain and oil. No, that would have drawn attention to her and would have destroyed the safety of her home for Elijah. No, I think God provided for her enough each day, just as he provided food through the ravens while Elijah was curing. So every morning she got up, and every morning she found there was enough food for the day, and every day she experienced a miracle from God. No attention was ever drawn to her to expose Elijah to danger. Her neighbors probably thought, boy, how fortunate is she to have a paying renter on the roof of her house at a time she would so desperately need it. God always meets the needs of his people. Yes, we go to work, I know. God designed us to work. Work is not part of the fall, the curse of sin. Work is part of the original design of creation. I believe in the new heaven and new earth, where we'll spend eternity. I believe that we will work. Because, we are made in the image of God, and God is productive. And therefore, I believe we will work. But there won't be any thorns and thistles anymore. Won't that be nice? But even though we go to work and that's God's normal way of supplying our needs, we all know there are times when that means of supply is inadequate. And in those moments, we need to believe that God will supply whatever it needs to maintain us as long as He wants us to live on this earth. Someday, we will have fulfilled what God has called us to do in this world, and He will say, great, come up here. And we will be done, and God won't meet any needs here anymore because we're done here. But as long as He wants us on this earth, He will meet our needs. And not only does He meet our needs, but just as in this case of Elijah, as He meets our needs, so through us and through meeting our needs, He meets the needs of others as well. So the blessing of our lives spill out on others. Just like 2 Corinthians 1 that says, we comfort others with the comfort we've received from God. So we receive comfort from God, and we use that to comfort others. And the children God blesses our homes with become adults that impact the world. The privilege of teaching a class, a Sunday school class, so touches the heart of somebody in that class that they go on to teach other people about Jesus. Or the finances I earn not only meet the needs of my family, but I have enough that maybe there are people around me less fortunate who have needs that they cannot meet that I can help. God meets our needs. But there's another lesson here too. It's a lesson about testing. In James 1, 2, and 3, it says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. This is not one of my favorite verses. Is it yours? Count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds. But, here's what it says. For you know, the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and then it goes on from there. God never tempts us to sin, James 1:13. He never tempts us to sin. If you're tempted to sin, you're drawn away by your own lust, Satan is throwing things in your path. God never tempts us to sin, but He does test us to stretch our faith so we become stronger and more confident in Him. And when we're going through difficult times, and especially when we're going through those times when we're surrounded by people who don't share our faith, just as this woman was, it's easy for them to sort of influence us to blame God or to say, well, if God really loved me, these things wouldn't happen. But the fact is, God wants us to trust Him through the problems, that He will meet our needs and reveal His next step for us just at the moment we need it, so He can reveal His glory. Because no matter how strenuous the experiences we're going through at the moment, it's always too early to quit on God. And if you don't believe me, ask the widow of Zarephath. She knows. Let's pray. Lord, thank You for this